A few days passed, and Ada buried herself in the only thing that could keep her mind away from Daniel: work. That afternoon, the bakery was unusually quiet. Ada stood behind the counter, trying not to think about him. Then, the door opened. Ada looked up. It was Mr. Bello, the same man who had supervised Daniel back when she believed Daniel was nothing more than an ordinary security guard. Ada managed a small smile. "Mr. Bello?" He nodded. "Good afternoon, Ada." But something about his expression made Ada realize this wasn't a casual visit. Mr. Bello glanced toward an empty table, then looked back at her. "Can we talk?" Ada hesitated. For a moment, she wondered if Daniel had sent him. But eventually, she nodded. Neither of them knew it yet, but the conversation they were about to have would change the way Ada saw Daniel. Because Mr. Bello knew something about him, something Daniel himself would never have told her. Ada and Mr. Bello sat opposite each other. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence made Ada uncomfortable. Finally, she looked at him. "Is this about Daniel?" Mr. Bello gave a small smile. "You already know it is." Ada immediately folded her arms. "If he sent you here." "He didn't." Mr. Bello interrupted gently. Ada paused. He looked directly at her. "Daniel doesn't even know I'm here." That changed something. Ada leaned back slightly, studying his face. "Then why are you here?" Mr. Bello took a slow breath. "Because I think there's something you deserve to know." Ada's expression became guarded again. Another thing she deserved to know? She had already discovered enough secrets about Daniel to last a lifetime. The fake bankruptcy, the security uniform, the commercial complex, all the things he had hidden from her. And now, Mr. Bello was sitting across from her, suggesting there was something else. Ada swallowed. Part of her wanted to hear it, but another part wasn't sure she could survive discovering one more truth about Daniel Adebayo. Mr. Bello looked directly at Ada. "I won't defend what Daniel did to you." Ada remained silent. "He lied to you." Mr. Bello paused. "And whatever his reasons were, you had every right to be angry." Ada's folded arms slowly relaxed. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had expected excuses, maybe even another attempt to convince her that Daniel's intentions made everything acceptable. But Mr. Bello offered neither. Instead, he continued, "But there's something else I think you should know." Ada watched him carefully. Mr. Bello told her about the changes happening inside Adebayo Holdings. Better working conditions, improved employee benefits, renovated facilities for the security workers, and something even more surprising. Daniel himself had changed. He now stopped to speak with workers, people he once walked past without noticing. He asked about their families. He learned their names. And more importantly, he listened. Ada remained quiet. Then finally, she asked the question that had been bothering her. "Why are you telling me all this?" Mr. Bello smiled slightly. "Because you might believe everything Daniel did was an act." He paused, then looked directly into Ada's eyes. "But I've worked around that man for years." Another pause. "And Ada, I know the difference between a man who's pretending to change and a man who actually has." Mr. Bello leaned forward slightly. "Daniel came to that security post, pretending to be someone else." Ada looked away. "I know." Mr. Bello nodded. "Yes, he came there pretending." He paused. "But Ada, he didn't leave that post as the same man." Ada slowly looked back at him. Mr. Bello began telling her everything he had seen. How Daniel had improved the working conditions for the security guards. How he approved better benefits. Not just for executives, but for workers who had spent years feeling invisible. Then Mr. Bello told her about his promotion. Ada looked surprised. "He promoted you?" Mr. Bello smiled. "Yes, but not because I asked him, and not because he was trying to impress anyone." He paused. He finally started noticing people. The words stayed with Ada. Mr. Bello continued. "Daniel now stops to speak with the security guards. He asks about their families. He learns their names. He listens to their problems. And Ada, I've worked for that man long enough to know he never used to do those things." Ada's expression slowly softened. Then Mr. Bello said something she wasn't prepared for. "I don't think that uniform only showed Daniel who you were, Ada." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Bello looked toward the security post outside, then back at her. "I think for the first time in his life, that uniform showed Daniel who he was." Ada became silent, because suddenly, she remembered the man who had stood beneath the Lego sun, the man who had carried boxes for her, the man who had sat beside ordinary workers. Without anyone knowing, he could buy the entire building. Perhaps Daniel had started everything as an experiment. But somewhere along the way, the experiment had changed him too. Mr. Bello slowly stood. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive him. Ada looked up, and Daniel didn't send me. He paused. Whatever you decide about him, that's your decision. But you deserve to make that decision, knowing the whole truth. Mr. Bello gave her a gentle nod, then walked toward the door. Ada remained seated, quiet, thinking. She still hadn't forgotten Daniel's lies. She still hadn't forgiven the pain he caused her. But for the first time, her anger was no longer the only voice inside her heart. Because now, Ada had to consider something she hadn't allowed herself to believe. What if Daniel really had changed? After Mr. Bello left, Ada remained quiet for a long time. His words wouldn't leave her mind. Eventually, she walked toward the bakery window. Outside, the security post was still there. The same little post she had walked past hundreds of times. And beside it was the chair where Daniel used to sit. Empty. Ada stared at it. For a moment, she could almost see him there again. Daniel, wearing that security uniform, sitting beneath the Lego's sun, pretending to be a man who had lost everything. She remembered the way he used to smile whenever she walked past. The way he would suddenly appear inside the bakery near closing time, pretending he only came to help. She remembered sharing food with him, their crowded bus rides, their walks home, the rain, the laughter, and those quiet evenings when Daniel would sit and listen while she talked about her dreams. Ada's eyes became emotional. Those memories had once made her happy. Then, they became painful, because after discovering Daniel's secret, Ada had questioned every single one of them. Was his laughter fake? Was his kindness part of the act? When he listened to her, was he really interested? And when he looked into her eyes, was that Daniel? Or just another part of the disguise? For weeks, Ada had been asking herself the same question. Which Daniel was real? The powerful billionaire, surrounded by luxury? Or the ordinary security guard, who sat outside her bakery every day? Ada looked at the empty chair again, and suddenly, another possibility entered her mind. Maybe she had been asking the wrong question. Maybe there weren't two Daniels. Maybe they had always been the same man. One was the man Daniel had spent years becoming, wealthy, powerful, and afraid to trust anyone. And the other was the man hiding underneath all of it. The man that little security post had slowly brought to the surface. Ada placed her hand gently against the window. For the first time, she wasn't looking at that empty chair and remembering only the lie. She was remembering the man who had sat in it. And somewhere deep inside her heart, Ada began to wonder if perhaps the security guard she fell in love with had been the real Daniel all along. Ada's eyes slowly filled with tears. She tried to fight them, but this time, she couldn't, because there was something she had refused to admit, even to herself. She missed him, not Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, not the chairman of a powerful company, not the man with the mansion, the Range Rover, or buildings across Lagos. She missed Daniel, the man who carried heavy boxes into her bakery, even when she insisted she could do it herself. The man who sat beside her on crowded buses, without complaining. The man who ate simple food with her, and somehow made those ordinary moments feel special. She missed their walks home, their conversations after closing, his terrible jokes, the way he listened when she talked about her dreams, as though nothing else in the world mattered. Ada wiped a tear from her cheek, and that was what hurt the most. Because despite everything, those memories still felt real. Forgiving Daniel frightened her. Because forgiveness meant opening a door she had fought desperately to close. And trusting him again, that frightened her even more. What if he hurt her again? What if she gave him her heart, only to discover another lie? Ada looked once more toward the empty security chair. She didn't have the answers. She wasn't ready to run back into Daniel's arms. And she certainly wasn't ready to pretend the betrayal had never happened. But there was one truth. She could no longer hide from herself. Daniel's lies had destroyed her trust. His deception had broken her heart. But somehow, through all the anger, all the tears, and all the pain, one thing had never disappeared. Ada had stopped trusting Daniel, but she had never stopped loving him. But before Ada could decide what to do with the feelings she still had for Daniel, life gave her something else to worry about. That evening, Ada closed the bakery as usual. The last customer left. The chairs were arranged. The lights went off, and Ada's kitchen became quiet for the night. Everything seemed normal, but somewhere inside the bakery, hidden behind the walls, An electrical fault had begun. At first, nothing happened. Then, a thin cloud of smoke slowly appeared. Minutes passed. The smoke became thicker, and suddenly, the alarm was raised. There was a fire at Ada's kitchen. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with flashing emergency lights. Firefighters rushed toward the building. People gathered at a safe distance. Thankfully, the bakery had already closed. No customers were inside. No workers were trapped, and no one was injured. But as smoke continued pouring from the building, the fire was destroying something else. Something Ada had sacrificed years of her life to build. That little bakery had survived difficult months, financial struggles, rent problems, heartbreak, and days when Ada barely had enough money to keep the doors open. Yet somehow, she had kept it alive. It wasn't simply where Ada worked. It was her dream, her independence, her proof that no matter what life took from her, she could always build something of her own. And now, in a matter of minutes, the dream Ada had spent years building was being destroyed right before her eyes. By the time Ada and Amaka arrived, emergency workers were already everywhere. Flashing lights filled the street. Smoke poured from the bakery, and Ada couldn't move. She stood at a safe distance, watching strangers fight to save the one thing she had spent years building. Amaka reached for her hand. But Ada barely heard her. Her eyes remained fixed on the bakery, because to everyone else, it was just a building, a small business, tables, chairs, ovens, a counter, things that could eventually be replaced. But to Ada, that bakery was years of her life. It was sleepless nights, waking before sunrise to prepare the first batch of bread. It was loans she had been terrified she wouldn't repay, days without customers, months when she barely made enough money to survive. It was every naira she had managed to save, invested into a dream everyone told her was too difficult. Ada remembered the first day she opened those doors. There had been almost nothing inside, just a few tables, a small oven, and hope. But little by little, she built something that belonged to her, something she was proud of. And now, Ada could do nothing but stand there and watch smoke rise from it. Amaka tightened her grip on her sister's hand. But Ada didn't speak. She couldn't, because standing on that Lego street, watching emergency workers disappear through the smoke, Ada wasn't simply watching a bakery being damaged. She was watching years of sacrifice, years of struggle, years of refusing to give up, disappear right before her eyes. The next morning, Ada returned to the bakery. The fire was gone. The emergency vehicles had left. The street was quiet again. But inside, the damage remained. Ada slowly stepped through the doorway and stopped. For several seconds, she couldn't move. The place she had walked into almost every morning for years barely looked like her bakery anymore. The walls were blackened. Equipment she had saved for months to buy was damaged. Tables and chairs were ruined, and the smell of smoke still hung heavily in the air. Ada walked farther inside, slowly, silently. Every step revealed something else she had lost. Then, she reached the counter. Her counter. Ada gently ran her fingers across its damaged surface. And suddenly, she remembered yesterday. Only yesterday, customers had been standing here. People were ordering food. Workers were moving between tables. Someone was laughing in the corner. Fresh bread filled the room with its smell. Ada had been complaining about how busy they were. Everything had felt normal, alive. Her dream was still growing. And now, there was nothing. No customers. No laughter. No smell of freshly baked bread. Only broken furniture, blackened walls, and silence. Ada looked around the room. She had faced difficult times before. She had survived months when the bakery barely made enough money to stay open. She had worked when she was exhausted. She had borrowed, saved, sacrificed, and started again more times than anyone knew. But this felt different. For the first time in years, Ada looked at the dream she had fought so hard to protect and couldn't see the next step. She didn't know where the money would come from. She didn't know how long rebuilding would take. She didn't even know if she had the strength to start all over again. Ada stood alone in the middle of the damaged bakery, surrounded by the remains of everything she had built. And for the first time, the woman who always found a way forward had absolutely no idea what to do next. Ada managed to walk outside before the strength she had been holding on to finally disappeared. She sat down in front of the bakery, and for a few seconds, she simply stared at the ground. Then, the tears came. Ada tried to wipe them away, but there were too many. And finally, she stopped trying. She cried. Not quietly, not carefully. She cried like someone who had spent years telling herself, just keep going. Someone who had survived every disappointment. By waking up the next morning and trying again, Amaka quickly sat beside her and pulled her into her arms. Ada, Ada buried her face against her sister and cried even harder. Amaka held her tightly. We'll rebuild. Ada slowly shook her head. Her voice barely came out. With what? Amaka became silent. Ada looked back at the damaged bakery. I put everything into that place, Amaka. Everything. Her voice broke. My savings. My time. My life. Amaka tightened her arms around her. We'll find a way. But Ada couldn't see one. She had survived losing her father. She had survived the heartbreak that followed. She had survived Kelvin. She had survived Daniel's betrayal, even when loving him made walking away almost impossible. And through every painful chapter of her life, there had always been one place Ada could return to. Her bakery. When everything else felt uncertain, Ada's kitchen had been hers. Her dream. Her independence. Her proof that no matter who walked out of her life, she could still stand on her own. But now, even that had been taken from her. Ada leaned into Amaka and cried until she had no strength left. Behind them stood the damaged remains of the dream she had protected through everything. Ada had no idea how she would rebuild it, no idea what tomorrow would look like, and she certainly didn't know that somewhere else in Lagos, Daniel was about to hear what had happened. That same morning, Toby walked into Daniel's office. Without knocking, Daniel immediately looked up. One look at Toby's face, and he knew something was wrong. What happened? Toby hesitated, then said the one name guaranteed to make Daniel forget everything else. It's Ada. Daniel immediately stood. What about her? Toby took a breath. There was a fire at the bakery last night. Daniel's face changed instantly. For one terrifying second, nothing else mattered. Is she okay? His voice was filled with panic. Tund quickly nodded. Yes. Ada is fine. Amaka too. Daniel exhaled deeply. His shoulders dropped with relief. Then, Toby continued. But the bakery was badly damaged. Daniel's relief disappeared. He knew what that bakery meant to Ada. It wasn't simply where she worked. It was her independence, her dream, something she had built with years of sacrifice, long before Daniel ever entered her life. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his jacket. I need to go. He took one step toward the door, then stopped. His hand tightened around the jacket. Toby watched him. Daniel. But Daniel didn't move, because suddenly, he remembered Ada's words. She wanted space. She had asked him to stay away, and Daniel had promised himself he would never again decide what Ada needed. Without asking Ada, every instinct inside him was screaming. Go to her. Hold her. Help her. Rebuild everything she lost. Daniel had enough money to restore the bakery without even thinking about the cost. By tomorrow, workers could be there. New equipment could be ordered. Every damaged thing could be replaced. But that was exactly how Daniel had made his mistakes before. He would see a problem, then use his money and power to solve it. Without ever asking Ada what she wanted, Daniel slowly looked down at the jacket in his hand. For the first time, helping Ada wasn't simply about what he had the power to do. It was about whether she wanted him to do it. And now, Daniel faced one of the hardest choices he had ever made, between what his heart desperately wanted and what the woman he loved had asked him to respect. Daniel stood beside his office window, staring across the Lagos skyline. Somewhere out there, Ada was standing in the ruins of everything she had worked so hard to build. And Daniel knew she was hurting. Everything inside him wanted to go to her, to get into his car, drive straight to that bakery, and tell her, I'll fix everything. And the truth was, he could. Daniel had enough money to rebuild Ada's kitchen tomorrow. He could replace every oven, every table, every chair, every piece of equipment. He could hire the best contractors in Lagos and have workers there before sunrise. One phone call, and Ada's problem could begin disappearing. Daniel reached for his jacket again. Then, he stopped, because suddenly, he understood. That was exactly the problem. The old Daniel would have gone to Ada without asking. He would have taken control, called contractors, spent whatever was necessary, and convinced himself he was doing it because he loved her. Just like the rent increase. Just like every other time he had made a decision about Ada's life. Without giving Ada a choice, Daniel closed his eyes. He finally understood that having the power to solve someone's problem didn't automatically give him the right to solve it. Ada didn't need another billionaire deciding what was best for her. She needed someone who respected her enough to let her decide. Daniel slowly removed his hand from the jacket, then placed it back down. It hurt, because every part of him wanted to be beside her, to comfort her, to tell her she wasn't alone. But this time, Daniel wasn't going to make his feelings more important than Ada's boundaries. If she wanted him, he would come. If she asked for his help, he would give her everything he could. But until then, Daniel would respect the distance she had asked for, even if that distance was breaking his heart. For once, loving Ada didn't mean rescuing her. It didn't mean fixing her problems. It didn't mean using his money to make the pain disappear. For once, loving Ada meant doing the hardest thing Daniel Adebayo could possibly do. Nothing. Unless she asked him. That night, Daniel's mansion was unusually quiet. He had spent the entire evening thinking about Ada, wondering how she was coping, wondering if she was crying, and fighting the same urge to pick up his phone and call her. But Daniel had made his decision. Until Ada wanted him in her life again, he would stay away. Then, the doorbell rang. Daniel looked up. He wasn't expecting anyone. Outside, Ada stood alone. For several seconds, she simply stared at the enormous mansion in front of her. The tall glass windows, the expensive cars, the beautiful lights, the kind of wealth that once would have immediately made her suspicious. Months earlier, this house would have represented everything Ada feared about men like Daniel. Money, power, control. But tonight, she barely noticed any of it. Because Ada hadn't come to see Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire. She hadn't come because she needed someone wealthy enough to rebuild her bakery. And she certainly hadn't come to ask him to rescue her. She had come because after one of the worst days of her life, there was one person she couldn't stop wishing had been beside her. Daniel. Ada took a nervous breath. For the first time since discovering his lies, she had come to him. Not because Daniel chased her. Not because he sent another gift. Not because he used his money to force his way back into her life. But because Ada had chosen to come. She slowly raised her hand toward the doorbell again. Then, before her finger could touch it, the door opened. Ada froze, and standing on the other side was Daniel. The door opened, and Daniel froze. For a moment, he genuinely thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Ada, she stood there, quietly, her eyes tired, her face carrying the weight of everything that had happened. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Daniel had imagined seeing Ada again, more times than he could count. He had imagined her walking back into the bakery, calling him, maybe even forgiving him someday. But he had never imagined this. Ada, standing outside his home, in the middle of the night. His first instinct was to step forward, to hold her, especially after everything she had just lost. Daniel almost moved, then stopped himself. He remembered. Ada hadn't come here to be rescued, and he no longer had the right to assume what she needed. So Daniel remained where he was. Ada, are you okay? Ada tried to nod, but after a moment, she slowly shook her head. I don't know. Those 3 words broke something inside him. Daniel's expression softened. He wanted to tell her everything would be fine. He wanted to promise he would rebuild the bakery. He wanted to make the pain disappear. But this time, he said nothing. He simply waited. Ada looked past him, into the enormous mansion, then back at Daniel. Can I come inside? Daniel's eyes briefly widened. He stepped aside immediately. Of course. Ada slowly crossed the doorway, and Daniel watched her enter. For the first time, Ada was stepping willingly into the world. Daniel had once been so desperate to hide from her. No security uniform. No fake bankruptcy. No pretending. Tonight, there was nowhere left for Daniel to hide. And perhaps, that was exactly why Ada had come. Ada stepped inside, and for the first time, she saw Daniel's real world. Marble floors, expensive artwork, beautiful furniture, a house so large, it seemed almost impossible that one man lived there alone. Every corner confirmed what Ada now knew. Daniel hadn't simply been comfortable. He was extraordinarily wealthy. The kind of wealthy he had once gone to great lengths to hide from her. Daniel watched Ada carefully. Weeks earlier, this was the moment he had feared most. He had believed that if Ada ever saw the mansion, the cars, the luxury, she would immediately see him differently. But something unexpected happened. Ada barely looked at any of it. No amazement, no fascination, no questions about how much anything cost. She simply walked inside and looked at Daniel. And suddenly, he understood something he should have understood from the beginning. His money had never been the problem. Ada wasn't afraid of marble floors. She wasn't afraid of expensive cars. And she certainly hadn't walked away because Daniel was a billionaire. She had walked away because he lied. Daniel had spent so much time trying to hide his wealth that he had hidden the one thing Ada actually needed from him: the truth. He quietly gestured toward the sofa. "You can sit down." But Ada remained standing. Her eyes stayed on him. Daniel lowered his hand, because now he understood. Ada hadn't come all this way to admire the mansion. She hadn't come to see how a billionaire lived. And she hadn't come looking for Daniel's money. Even after losing almost everything in the fire, she had come for something far more important. Something Daniel couldn't buy. Something his wealth couldn't provide. Answers. And this time, Ada wasn't interested in Daniel Adebayo's world. She wanted the truth, from the man standing inside it. Ada looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then finally, she asked the question that had been sitting inside her all day. "You heard about the fire?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." "When?" "This morning." Ada stared at him. Her expression changed. "Then, why didn't you come?" Daniel became silent. Ada searched his face. "I kept waiting for you." Her voice cracked. "Every time a car stopped outside, I thought it might be you." Daniel lowered his eyes. Those words hurt more than Ada knew. Because while she had been waiting, he had been fighting every instinct inside him not to go to her. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Because you asked me to stay away." Ada froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Daniel continued quietly. "Ada, everything inside me wanted to come. The moment Tun told me what happened, I grabbed my jacket. I was ready to leave." He paused. "I wanted to come to the bakery. I wanted to hold you. I wanted to call contractors that same morning. Replace everything you lost. And rebuild Ada's kitchen before you even had time to worry about it." Ada's eyes began filling with tears. Daniel looked directly at her. "But then I realized, that would have been me doing it again." Ada frowned slightly. "Doing what?" "Deciding for you." Daniel swallowed. "Taking control and calling it love." Ada became completely still. Daniel's voice softened. "I finally understood something. Just because I have the money to solve your problems doesn't mean I have the right to decide how they're solved." A tear slipped down Ada's cheek. Daniel didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was. "I wanted to help you, Ada. God knows. Staying away was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But you asked me for space." He paused. "And for once, I wanted what you asked for to matter more than what I wanted to do." Ada stared at him through her tears. Because suddenly, she understood. Daniel hadn't stayed away because he didn't care. He had stayed away because he finally did. Daniel took a small step toward Ada, then stopped. He wanted to be closer to her. But this time, he respected the distance between them. For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Then quietly, "I used to think loving someone meant protecting them." He swallowed. "Fixing their problems. Making things easier for them." Ada listened through her tears. Daniel lowered his eyes. "But with you, I kept making decisions you never asked me to make." He paused. "I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself I was helping you. But the truth is," Daniel looked back at her, "I was controlling you." Ada's expression changed. Daniel continued. "I lied about who I was because I wanted to control how you saw me. I pretended to have nothing because I was afraid you wouldn't trust me if you knew I was wealthy." He shook his head. "So instead of giving you the truth and allowing you to decide for yourself, I made that decision for you." Ada's tears began falling faster. Daniel's voice grew softer. "And when the rent increased, I did it again. I had the power to make the problem disappear. So I used it. I never asked you. I never told you. I simply decided what was best for your life and called it love." Ada covered her mouth. Daniel's eyes became emotional. "I finally understand why you walked away." A long pause. "You weren't angry because I was rich. You were angry because I took away your right to choose." Ada stared at him. Daniel shook his head slowly. "Loving you doesn't give me ownership over your decisions. It doesn't give me the right to control your life. And having enough money to change your circumstances doesn't mean I should change them without your permission." His voice almost broke. "And Ada, even if you never forgive me, even if you never trust me again, even if you never choose me again." He paused. "Your choices still deserve my respect." Ada began to cry. Because finally, Daniel wasn't asking her to forget. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't hiding behind good intentions. And he wasn't saying "I'm sorry." simply because he wanted her back. For the first time, Daniel understood exactly what his deception had taken from her. Her choice. And that was when Ada realized. This wasn't another apology from the man who had hurt her. It was something far more important. Proof that Daniel finally understood why he needed to be sorry. Ada wiped the tears from her face, but more immediately replaced them. For a moment, she couldn't look at Daniel. Then quietly, she asked, "Do you know what the worst part of all this is?" Daniel said nothing. He simply waited. Ada took a trembling breath. "The worst part isn't that you're a billionaire." She shook her head. "It isn't the mansion, the companies, or even the fact that you stood outside my bakery every day, pretending to be a security guard." Daniel lowered his eyes. Ada's voice began to break. "The worst part is, after everything you did." She paused. "I still missed you." Daniel slowly looked up. Ada fought back another tear. "I tried to hate you, Daniel. I really did. I reminded myself of every lie, every secret, every moment you could have told me the truth, and chose not to." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Ada continued, "I thought if I stayed angry long enough, eventually, I wouldn't feel anything for you anymore." She shook her head. But it didn't work. Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. Ada looked directly into his eyes. "I stopped trusting you." A long pause. But somehow, her voice broke. "I never stopped loving you." Daniel closed his eyes, and one tear slowly rolled down his face. Those were the words he had desperately wanted to hear. But this time, Daniel didn't rush toward her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't use her confession as permission to erase everything that had happened. He simply stood there and allowed her words to settle between them. For several seconds, neither of them moved. No embrace, no kiss, no promise that everything was suddenly okay. Because it wasn't. Ada loved him, but she was still hurt. Daniel loved her, but he still had to earn back what his lies had destroyed. Trust. And perhaps that was the biggest proof that Daniel really had changed. The old Daniel would have tried to fix everything that night. The new Daniel understood. Some things couldn't be fixed in one conversation. They had to be rebuilt. Slowly. Honestly. One choice at a time. So Daniel remained where he was. Tears in his eyes. Looking at the woman he loved. Because tonight, Ada had given him something he thought he had lost forever. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something powerful enough to give them both hope. A second chance to begin again. Months passed, and life slowly began to move forward. The fire had taken almost everything inside Ada's bakery. But there was one thing it couldn't destroy. Ada's determination. She didn't rebuild overnight. There were difficult days, long meetings, plans that had to be changed, budgets that didn't always work, and moments when Ada wondered if starting again was simply too much. But every morning, she got up and tried again. Little by little, the damaged bakery disappeared, and in its place, something new began to rise. Not the old Ada's kitchen, something better, something bigger, and most importantly, something that still belonged to her. Workers completed the final touches. Brand new equipment arrived. New tables filled the dining area. The kitchen was larger. The space was brighter. And then, one afternoon, the final sign was installed above the entrance. Ada looked up. Ada's kitchen. For a moment, she simply stood there, silent. She remembered the morning after the fire, when she had walked through blackened walls, and wondered if she would ever have the strength to begin again. Now, she had her answer. Amaka stood nearby smiling. Workers moved around them, finishing the last details. But Ada barely noticed. Her eyes remained on that sign. The fire had destroyed a building. It hadn't destroyed her dream. Ada smiled, her eyes becoming emotional. Because this wasn't simply the return of her bakery. It was proof that losing everything didn't always mean going back to the beginning. Sometimes, when life forces you to rebuild, you discover that you're capable of building something stronger than what you lost. Ada took one last look at the new Ada's kitchen. This time, she wasn't starting over. She was starting stronger. Daniel did eventually become part of Ada's business. But this time, everything was different. There were no secret favors, no hidden phone calls, no decisions made behind Ada's back, and no billionaire quietly using his influence to control what happened next. Instead, Daniel did something he should have done from the beginning. He gave Ada a choice. They sat together at a table, with an independent professional advisor between them. Every condition was explained. Every figure was discussed. Every risk was made clear. Ada asked questions. Daniel answered them. And whenever she disagreed, Daniel listened. No pressure, No manipulation. No. I know what's best for you. For once, Daniel wasn't trying to save Ada's dream. He was asking permission to become part of it. The advisor finally placed the agreement in front of her. Ada looked down at the document. Months earlier, Daniel had used his power to make decisions that affected her life, without her knowledge. Now, the decision was entirely hers. Daniel didn't reach for the pen. He didn't encourage her. He simply waited. Ada read the final page, then looked at him. Daniel met her eyes, but said nothing. And after a moment, Ada smiled. She picked up the pen and signed. Daniel smiled too, not because he had gained control of Ada's business, but because Ada had chosen to trust him with a small part of her dream. And Daniel finally understood. There was a difference between being needed and being chosen. This wasn't Daniel's money rescuing Ada. It wasn't charity. It wasn't control disguised as love. It was two people, sitting at the same table, with honesty, respect, and equal voices. It was partnership. And for Ada, that difference meant everything. Finally, the day Ada had worked so hard for arrived. Ada's kitchen was reopening. That morning, the entrance was filled with people. Old customers returned. New customers came to see what Ada had rebuilt. Friends gathered. Workers stood proudly outside, admiring the place they had helped bring back to life. And in the middle of it all stood Ada. She looked up at the sign above the entrance. Ada's kitchen. For a moment, the noise around her seemed to disappear. Ada remembered the fire, the smoke, the damaged walls, the morning she stood inside the ruins, wondering if her dream was over. She remembered sitting outside, crying in Amaka's arms, with no idea how she would ever begin again. And now, she was standing in front of something even greater than what she had lost. Amaka stepped closer. "Are you ready?" Ada smiled through emotional eyes. "I'm ready." She took the scissors. Everyone began counting. 3, 2, 1. Ada cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, laughter. Amaka screamed louder than everyone, exactly as Ada expected. Mr. Bello stood nearby, applauding proudly. The bakery workers celebrated, and Daniel stood among them, quietly watching Ada smile. He didn't rush forward. He didn't try to make a speech. He didn't stand beside the ribbon, as though her success belonged to him. Because Daniel understood. This was Ada's moment. Her bakery, her dream, her comeback. And watching her standing there, stronger than before, was enough for him. Months earlier, Daniel believed loving Ada meant standing in front of her, protecting her, solving her problems, and deciding which direction her life should take. But now, he understood something far more important. Ada had never needed Daniel to lead her life. She simply needed him to respect the woman capable of leading her own. Daniel smiled as Ada welcomed the first customers inside. He didn't need to stand in front of her anymore, because finally, Daniel had learned how to stand beside her. Later that afternoon, the reopening celebration had settled down, but Ada's kitchen was still busy. Then, Daniel walked through the door, straight from an important business meeting. Expensive suit, polished shoes, luxury watch, briefcase in hand. Everything about him said, "Billionaire chairman." Ada looked up from behind the counter. Then slowly, she looked him up and down. Daniel noticed immediately. He narrowed his eyes. "What?" Ada said nothing. She simply smiled. And Daniel knew that smile. "Ada, what are you planning?" Still smiling, Ada reached beneath the counter. First, she pulled out an apron. Daniel stared at it. Then, she produced a cleaning cloth. His smile disappeared. "Ada," she walked over and placed both items in his hands. Daniel looked down at them, then back at her. "What exactly am I supposed to do with these?" Ada pointed towards several empty tables. Customers just left. Daniel followed her finger, then looked down at his perfectly tailored suit, back at the tables, and finally, back at Ada. "Wait." He pointed at himself. "You want me to clean those tables?" Ada nodded innocently. "Yes." Daniel stared at her. "Ada, I just came from a board meeting." "I know. I am still wearing my suit." "I can see that." Daniel looked at the apron again, then at Ada. "You're serious?" Ada's smile grew wider. "Very." For a moment, Daniel simply stared at her. Months ago, Ada had fallen in love with a man she believed was an ordinary security guard. Now, she knew exactly who he was. The billionaire, the chairman, the owner of companies across Lagos, and apparently, the newest cleaner at Ada's kitchen. Daniel looked at the cloth one more time, then sighed. "Ada Obi, you're enjoying this, aren't you?" Ada tried to hide her smile. Put the apron on, Daniel. And for perhaps the first time in his billionaire life, Daniel Adebayo realized there was one boss he wasn't going to win an argument with. Asterisk, asterisk. Daniel stared at the apron, then at Ada. He placed one hand dramatically against his chest. Excuse me, do you know who you're talking to? Ada burst out laughing. Yes. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You do? Ada nodded confidently, then pointed straight at him. My part-time cleaner. Daniel's mouth fell open. Ada Obi. She laughed even harder. What? Daniel straightened his suit, as though she had just insulted his entire business empire. I manage companies. Ada nodded seriously. I know. Hundreds of employees report to me. Wonderful. I sit in boardrooms and make decisions worth millions. Ada calmly handed him the cleaning cloth again. And today, she pointed toward the other side of the bakery. You're managing table number 6. Daniel slowly turned. He looked at table number 6, then at the cloth in his hand, then back at Ada. For several seconds, he said absolutely nothing. Ada was already struggling not to laugh. Finally, Daniel shook his head. You have no respect for billionaires. Ada smiled. Not when there are dirty tables. Daniel tried to maintain his offended expression, but he couldn't. A smile appeared. Then, he laughed, and Ada laughed with him. It was such a simple moment. But months earlier, Daniel had put on a security uniform and pretended to be an ordinary man because he believed that was the only way Ada could love him. Now, Ada knew everything. She knew about the mansion, the companies, the money, the man behind the security uniform. And still, she could stand there, teasing him, laughing with him, and handing him a cleaning cloth. Daniel looked at Ada and smiled, because finally, he didn't have to become somebody else to feel loved by her. He could simply be Daniel. And so, one of Lagos's wealthiest businessmen rolled up the sleeves of his expensive suit, picked up a cleaning cloth, and started wiping tables. Ada stood beside him, watching with obvious amusement. Daniel wiped the first table, then stepped back proudly. Done. Ada looked at the table, then at Daniel. She shook her head. Daniel, you missed a spot. Daniel frowned. Where? Ada pointed. Right there. Daniel looked closely. Ada, there's nothing there. Ada burst out laughing. Daniel stared at her. You're enjoying this too much. She tried to control her laughter. Maybe. Daniel shook his head and went back to cleaning. A customer walked past, completely unaware that the man wiping the table owned companies worth millions. Another customer casually handed Daniel an empty cup. Please take this too. Daniel stared at the cup, then slowly looked at Ada. Ada immediately turned away, trying desperately not to laugh. Daniel sighed. Unbelievable. But then, he smiled, picked up the cup, and continued working. And strangely, Daniel didn't feel embarrassed. He didn't feel less important. He didn't need anyone in that bakery to know how much money he had, or how powerful he was outside those doors. Because the one person whose opinion mattered most already knew everything. Ada knew about the mansion, the Range Rover, the companies, the billionaire behind the security uniform. But she also knew the man who could roll up his sleeves, wipe a cafe table, and laugh with her about it. Months earlier, Daniel had hidden his identity because he desperately wanted an answer to one question. Could Ada love him without his money? Now, he finally understood that he never needed a disguise to find the answer. He only needed honesty. Daniel looked toward Ada. She was still laughing, still teasing him, still standing beside him. And this time, there was nothing between them to hide. No security uniform, no fake bankruptcy, no secret test, no lies. Just Daniel, exactly as he was. And Ada, knowing exactly who he was still standing beside him, smiling. One evening, after another busy day at Ada's kitchen, Daniel asked Ada to meet him outside. He didn't explain why. He simply said, "Trust me." Ada almost laughed at the choice of words, but something in Daniel's voice made her curious. So after work, she went to meet him. But when Ada arrived, Daniel wasn't waiting inside the bakery. He wasn't beside his car. He wasn't even near the entrance. Instead, he was standing beside something Ada hadn't paid attention to in months. The old security post. Ada stopped walking. For a moment, she simply stared. That little post, that gate, that old chair. None of it looked important. But to Ada, that tiny corner of the commercial complex held an entire chapter of her life. This was where she first noticed Daniel, where she had believed he was an ordinary security guard, trying to rebuild his life. It was where their awkward conversations began, where friendship slowly became something more, where Ada had started falling for him. Long before she knew his real name carried power across Lagos. She looked at the chair, and memories returned. Daniel sitting there in his uniform. His ridiculous jokes. The way he always seemed to notice when she was having a bad day. The man she had fallen in love with. Before everything became complicated, Ada slowly looked back at Daniel. Tonight, there was no security uniform. No disguise. Daniel stood before her in his expensive suit, exactly as himself. Ada narrowed her eyes. Daniel. He smiled. But something was different. Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire who could walk into a boardroom without blinking, actually looked nervous. Ada became immediately suspicious. What are you doing? Daniel cleared his throat. Nothing. Ada raised an eyebrow. Daniel. He smiled nervously again. And somehow, that made things worse. Ada folded her arms. Why did you bring me here? Daniel looked at the security post, then back at the woman he loved. Because of all the places his money could have taken them, there was only one place, where what he wanted to do next would truly mean something. The place where their story began. Daniel took a slow step toward Ada. The nervous smile was still on his face. Ada watched him carefully. Daniel, why are you looking at me like that? Daniel took a breath. Ada, there's something I need to ask you. Ada's eyes narrowed immediately. I don't like that face. Daniel laughed nervously. What face? That face you're making. Daniel tried to smile, but Ada could see it. His hands were nervous. His voice wasn't as steady as usual, and somehow, seeing Daniel Adebayo nervous made her even more curious. This was a man who negotiated million-naira deals without hesitation. A man who could walk into a room filled with powerful executives and command everyone's attention. Yet standing beside that little security post, in front of Ada, Daniel suddenly seemed unsure of himself. Ada tilted her head. Daniel, what is going on? He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached inside his suit pocket. Ada's smile disappeared. Her eyes followed his hand. Daniel. He paused. Then, slowly, he pulled something out. A small, elegant box. Ada's eyes widened. Her hand immediately moved toward her mouth. For one long moment, she forgot how to breathe. She looked at the box, then at Daniel, then back at the security post beside them. And suddenly, everything made sense. Why Daniel had asked her to meet him after work. Why he hadn't waited inside the bakery. Why he had brought her back to this exact spot. The place where she first met him. The place where she first trusted him. And the place where she had unknowingly begun falling in love with a billionaire. Dressed as a security guard, Ada's heart began pounding. Daniel. But before she could say anything else, Daniel began lowering himself onto one knee. Before Ada could say another word, Daniel slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Ada froze. Her hand immediately covered her mouth. Daniel. He looked up at her, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The cars, the people, the noise of Lagos, even the bakery behind them. All that remained was Ada, Daniel, and the little security post beside them. The exact place where everything had started. Ada's eyes filled with tears, because kneeling before her was Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, the chairman, the man who owned buildings, companies, and more money than Ada had ever imagined. But none of that mattered here, because this was also the man who once sat beside that security post, wearing a simple uniform. The man who carried boxes into her bakery, shared meals with her, walked her home, sat beside her on crowded buses, and slowly, without Ada even realizing it, stole her heart. Daniel looked toward the old security chair, then back at Ada. His voice softened. This is where you first saw me. Ada fought back her tears. Daniel continued. Back then, you didn't know my name. You didn't know about my companies, my house, my money. He paused. You thought I had almost nothing. Daniel smiled through his emotion. And somehow, you still saw something in me. A tear rolled down Ada's cheek. Daniel's eyes became emotional too. I came to this security post because I wanted to test whether someone could love me without my wealth. He slowly shook his head. But I know now, I was the one who needed to learn something. Ada stared at him. Daniel continued quietly. You taught me that being loved isn't about hiding who you are. It isn't about testing someone. And it certainly isn't about controlling them. He looked directly into her eyes. It's about being completely known and still having the courage to ask someone to choose you. Ada covered her mouth again, crying now. and beside the little security post, where their complicated love story had first begun, Daniel held the small box in his hand, looked up at the woman he loved, and prepared to ask her the most important question of his life. Daniel slowly opened the small box. Inside was an elegant engagement ring. Ada's hand immediately covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. Daniel looked up at her, and for a moment, he simply stared at the woman who had changed his life. Then, he spoke. Ada, when I first came to this place, I came with a test. Ada listened through her tears. Daniel continued. I was afraid. Afraid that nobody could ever love Daniel Adebayo without first loving everything Daniel Adebayo owned. He glanced toward the security post. So I put on that uniform. I hid my money. I hid my companies. I hid my entire life. And I convinced myself that if you loved the man I pretended to be, then I would finally know your love was real. Daniel slowly shook his head. But I was wrong. Ada's tears began falling. Daniel's voice softened. Because love isn't something you test. A pause. It's something you earn. And trust. He swallowed. Trust is something you protect. Daniel looked directly into her eyes. I hurt you because I was so afraid of being deceived that I became the one doing the deceiving. Ada covered her mouth tighter. And I can't change what I did. I can't promise you that I'll never make another mistake. But Ada, his voice became emotional. I can promise you, I'll never build our future on another lie. Daniel gently raised the ring toward her. No disguise. A pause. No secrets. Another pause. No tests. He smiled through the emotion in his eyes. Just me, Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, the stubborn man who sometimes thinks he can fix everything. Ada laughed softly through her tears. Daniel smiled. And the man who loves you more than anything his money could ever buy. Ada's tears continued falling. Daniel took a slow breath. Completely known. No pretending. No hiding. Just me, asking you to choose me, with the same freedom I should have given you from the very beginning. He held the ring toward her. If you'll have me. Ada stared at him, unable to speak. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Then, beside the little security post where their entire story had begun, he finally asked the question. Ada Obi. A long pause. Will you marry me? Ada stared down at Daniel. Through her tears. For a few seconds, she couldn't speak. Daniel remained on one knee, waiting, for perhaps the first time in his life. The billionaire who could control almost everything around him could do absolutely nothing. The decision belonged entirely to Ada. Then, she heard movement behind him. Ada looked up, and her eyes widened. Amaka was standing there, already fighting back tears. Beside her, Mr. Bello, the bakery workers, security guards, employees, people who had watched their complicated story unfold, were gathered quietly behind Daniel, waiting, smiling, hoping. Ada looked back at the man kneeling before her, and suddenly, she remembered everything. The security uniform, the crowded buses, the meat pie they shared, their walks home, the laughter, then, the lies, the heartbreak, the tears, the months apart, and finally, the man Daniel had worked so hard to become. The man kneeling before her wasn't the poor security guard she had once believed him to be. But he wasn't simply Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, either. He was just Daniel, flawed, imperfect, changed, completely known, and finally, honest. Ada slowly extended her hand. Daniel's eyes filled with hope, but he didn't move. He waited for her choice. Ada looked directly into his eyes. Then, through her tears, she whispered, "Yes." Daniel froze. For a second, it seemed as though he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Ada laughed through her tears. "Yes, Daniel." His face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. Ada nodded. "I'll marry you." Daniel closed his eyes, overwhelmed. And then, everyone behind them erupted. Amaka screamed. The workers cheered. Mr. Bello applauded proudly. Laughter filled the entrance of Ada's kitchen, and beside the little security post, where a billionaire once hid behind a uniform, Ada had finally chosen him. Not because he was poor, not because he was rich, not because he had changed her circumstances, but because this time, she knew exactly who Daniel Adebayo was. And with the truth finally between them, she still said yes. Daniel slowly stood, his eyes still filled with tears. Then, he gently pulled Ada into his arms. And this time, Ada didn't step away. She held him, tightly. Behind them, Amaka screamed with excitement. Mr. Bello applauded proudly. The bakery workers cheered. Security guards joined the celebration. And for a few beautiful seconds, laughter filled the entire entrance of Ada's kitchen. But standing quietly beside all that happiness was something small, something ordinary, something most people passing by would never understand. The security post, the place where everything had begun. Daniel looked toward it and smiled. Months earlier, he had stood inside that little post wearing a security uniform, hiding a life worth millions. He had believed he needed to become poor to discover whether a woman could truly love him. So he hid the mansion, the Range Rover, the companies, the billionaire name, everything. But in the end, Ada wasn't the person who needed to be tested. Daniel was. He had entered Ada's life believing his greatest problem was finding someone who didn't want his money. Instead, he discovered that his greatest problem was the man his money had allowed him to become. A man accustomed to control. A man who could solve almost any problem with one phone call. A man so terrified of being deceived that he became the one doing the deceiving. And Ada, without ever trying to change him, changed everything. Daniel learned that money could build mansions. It could buy beautiful cars. It could create companies and put his name on buildings across Lagos. Money could solve problems. It could open doors. It could make powerful people listen. But there were some things even billions couldn't buy: trust, forgiveness, and most importantly, love. Ada slowly pulled away from Daniel and looked down at the ring on her finger. Then, she looked back at him. There was nothing left to hide. She knew about the money. She knew about the companies. She knew about the mansion. But she also knew about his mistakes, his lies, his fears, his weaknesses. She knew the man behind the expensive suit and the man who once sat inside that security post. She knew exactly who Daniel Adebayo was. Not the version he created to impress her. Not the version he created to test her. The real Daniel. And still, Ada chose him. Daniel gently pulled her closer. As the golden Lagos sunset stretched across the sky, around them, their friends continued celebrating. But for Daniel and Ada, the world seemed quiet. Their story had begun with a lie. But the life they were about to build together would begin with something far stronger: the truth. Because sometimes, the greatest love story isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about two imperfect people, learning, forgiving, growing, and choosing each other with their eyes completely open. Daniel became a security guard because he wanted to discover whether someone could love him without his billions. But somewhere between that security post, Ada's little bakery, the heartbreak, and the second chance, Daniel discovered something even more valuable than the love he had been searching for. He discovered the kind of man he wanted to become. And Ada? She finally got the one thing Daniel should have given her from the very beginning: the freedom to know the truth and choose him anyway. The billionaire security guard had finally found true love. But more importantly, he had finally learned how to love. The end.